It is said that corruption and greed in Africa has killed more people than disease and war combined. Through corruption and greed, the majority of African leaders have further impoverished an already exploited and raped continent. In today's video, I will be discussing the issue of corruption and greed by pointing out 9 lessons from the movie Animal Farm. Coming right up. What is up, everybody? My name is KG and I'm here with yet another video. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell so that you can be notified when I upload new content. Animal Farm is a movie released in 1999 by Hallmark Films and broadcast on the American cable channel TNT. It is an adaptation of the 1945 George Orwell novel of the same name. The movie tells the story of farm animals successfully revolting against their human owner, only to slide into a more brutal tyranny among themselves. So what can we learn from Animal Farm? Let's get straight to it. Lesson number 1. Anything built on a wrong or unjust foundation ultimately collapses. In Animal Farm, humans abused the animals and exploited them until the animals decided they had enough. The apartheid regime in South Africa carried on for a long time until the people decided that enough was enough, and they united against the unjust regime. Even though freedom was a lengthy process, finally it came and the regime was abolished and a so-called democratic governmental style was introduced. The lesson here is that no matter how powerful any unjust system may seem, it cannot remain when the people unite and stand up against it. History has also taught us that no human empire stands forever, no matter how mighty it seems. The Babylonian, Egyptian, Greek and Roman empires all seemed invincible, but all of them eventually collapsed. Individually, black South Africans were powerless against the giant government, but together they were able to bring it down. Edmund Burke said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Evil, injustice, and corruption is so prevalent in our world, so much that we have become desensitized to it. We have normalized the abnormal, and even people with the knowledge, skills, and power to do something are not doing anything. All it takes is for every good person to say, enough is enough. We can't tolerate the crime, the corruption, the rape, the abuse, the con artistry, the complacent and greedy governments, and the terrorism anymore. There is power in numbers. The problem with us is that we have not reached the heights of our pain, which is why we continue to tolerate all these things happening in our societies. An abused man or woman will continue going back to their abusive partner until they reach what I refer to as their pain threshold, where they can't take anymore. There is a saying that says, what you tolerate persists. For as long as we tolerate the kidnappings, the hijackings, the robberies, the human trafficking, the senseless killings, the governmental corruption, the domestic abuse, the greed by certain companies, these things will continue to scar our land until we truly become tired of them. It is not just the government's responsibility, it is everyone's responsibility. What can you do in your community to advance a noble cause? Things will remain the same until you do something. Use your unique gift to contribute positively towards a better world. Everyone expects someone else to do something, yet change ought to begin with you. If everyone were to adopt this attitude, criminals, corrupt government officials, and these fake prophets would have a harder time getting away with their evil deeds. Professor Patrick Lumumba from Kenya is one of the people I admire in this regard. Now here is a man who is not afraid to speak up against mental slavery, corruption, and greed. His work has transformed the minds of many. There are so many injustices that exist in the modern world, and they only persist because we tolerate them. Lesson number 2. In his address of the animal masses, the old wise pig, Old Major, said the following, and I quote, "My friends, I don't think I will be with you for many days more. I had a long life, and now it is my duty to pass on to you such as I understand of the nature of our lives. Animal kind is born into a miserable, laborious, and short existence. We are given only just enough food to sustain the breath in our bodies for the work we do. And when our usefulness has come to an end, we are slaughtered with hideous cruelty. And who is responsible for our suffering? Mankind. Mankind is our enemy. Remove man and the root cause of our hunger and overwork is abolished forever. Remove man and the produce of our labor will be our own. Remove man and overnight we will become free and equal. We must never come to resemble man in any way or engage in trade. Amongst us animals, there must be unity and comradeship. All animals are friends. All humans are enemies. Now, my friends, I will tell you about the end of my dream and a song that came to me. It's a song you must learn. It's a song of justice and freedom. These are the words of the song. Beasts of the world, we shall unite. Rise up and ready for the fight. Soon or late, the day will be when man is defeated and we are free. Our dreams will not be broken and our hearts will not be torn. Close quote. Now, man in this context represents greedy capitalists and governments, and the animals represent the general population. The majority of people are exploited by greedy corporations, and when they can't work no more, they are discarded as though they don't matter, and are given a lousy service certificate and a pension amount that will only sustain them for a few months. The majority of people get paid just enough for them to afford the transport to go to work. The majority of people get paid just enough to stay in the parasitical work relationship and for them to pay debts from month to month. Unfortunately, Old Major was killed shortly after his address, but his words of wisdom permeated the hearts of all the animals. Though he was no longer with them, his vision remained with his fellow animals. He really inspired them to rise up and claim back their freedom. Lesson number 3. Until you no longer show your desperation by accepting the peanuts they give you, greedy capitalists will continue to use and take advantage of you. Now, I'm not saying that every company exploits its employees. There are many companies that take care of their employees and reward them fairly for their contribution. Yet there are many others who don't care about their people and are only interested in making as much money as possible at the expense of their people. In Animal Farm, inspired by the words of Old Major, Jessie the dog suddenly refused to accept the piece of meat that his owner used to give her. Old Major had indeed started a revolution. He had planted the seeds of a new paradigm in the hearts of the animals. Out of frustration, the farm owner stopped feeding the animals. He went away and things became tough for the animals. See, freedom is painful. If you really want to be free, you must expect hard days ahead. The pursuit of freedom will disrupt your routine. It may even result in loss of income and a bit of lack. In other words, the pursuit of freedom will not be a comfortable process, but when freedom finally comes, it will be worth it. The more the people challenged the oppressive regime in South Africa, the more laws were introduced to oppress them. The more Moses told Pharaoh to release the Israelites, the harder their labor became. Anyone who stands up against an established unjust system is victimized. It's part of the price of freedom. Freedom requires personal sacrifice for longer-term gain. Quitting a job that is not in line with your core values and talents is some type of pursuit of freedom. And even though the days that follow that decision may be hard, you will one day be glad that you chose to follow your values instead of settling for way less than what you are truly worth and what you are. If you're not willing to endure difficult days as you pursue your dreams, then maybe a mediocre existence is just right for you. Lesson number 4. After the animals waited for long to be fed, the farmer did not come and the animals decided to help themselves and go look for food. It is easy to wait for a monthly paycheck than it is to use your own creativity and gift to write your own paycheck. But when your cheese moves, when you lose your job, or when the job you used to tolerate becomes too oppressive or too demanding, you may be forced to look within yourself to discover your unique gift and learn to package it in such a way that it becomes the new source of your bread. Lesson number 5. After the farmer was forced to run away due to the animals' uprising, the animals were free and the farm was now theirs. For the first time, they were in full control of the farm's resources. Snowball and Napoleon became their new leaders. When the animals entered the farmer's house, they were surprised to see how luxurious the farmer's lifestyle was, while they survived from one meal to the next. Truth of the matter is that CEOs and owners of certain corporations live in unthinkable luxury, while the people who toil day and night in their companies live in shacks and small houses. The reality is that some greedy capitalists have a collection of expensive whiskeys and they have more than enough food while their employees struggle for transport and large money every single month. These greedy capitalists are not different from the false prophets who own as many as 6 cars, while the people they con can't even afford a McDonald's meal. These greedy capitalists are not different from greedy and corrupt government officials who misuse taxpayers' money on lavish lifestyles and first-class trips, while kids fall into holes and die in schools because there are no proper toilets. I always say that I have nothing against a comfortable lifestyle. If you work hard, you deserve a good life. But I have a problem with greed and corruption, where people gain fleshy lifestyles at the expense of the poor and the vulnerable. I have a problem with unjust remuneration systems, where people are overworked but paid less than the value of their output. I have a problem with a government that collects money from the people but fails to deliver basic services and fails to create programs that will empower its people financially. Thomas Sankara said, "We are not against progress, but we do not want progress that is anarchic and criminally neglects the rights of others." Instead of empowering people to be financially independent, our government has promoted a mindset of dependency and grants. Disguised as welfare, grants are political vehicles to keep people dependent on the government so that they can continue voting emotionally and keep in power a government that is no longer serving them. Why not create highly effective business incubators that will ensure that new business startups succeed and compete internationally? Why not change the entire education system, which is clearly not working, and introduce school programs that will ensure that the unique potential of every learner is identified and supported so that every single person can contribute to the GDP of the nation? Instead of giving them fish every day, why not teach the people how to fish? Instead of giving them a grant, why don't you empower and support the people to create their own income by becoming the CEOs of their own gifts? Lesson number 6 from Animal Farm. While Snowball worked hard to uphold the good teachings and sincere vision of Old Major, who wanted all animals to be equal in the land, Napoleon and his close ally Squealer developed their own selfish agenda. Napoleon started recruiting the young ones and brainwashed them using a limiting education system that was disguised as empowerment. In this way, Napoleon got to control the worldview of the animals. When you gain control of how the masses think and behave, blind obedience becomes easy. Not only did he brainwash the young ones, but he also separated them from their parents. Jessie the dog became worried and demanded to see his children, but Napoleon refused, telling her that the children need to be taught in isolation. Worried that the sadness of Jessie will be adopted by other parents, Napoleon devised a way to distract them. There are many things wrong with our society and how certain things are being done, but to keep people from questioning the status quo, governments and greedy corporations collaborate and come up with various things to distract the people from the truth. While Squealer was bombarding the farm animals with the so-called animalism doctrine, one animal raised a concern about the inequality in terms of the sharing of the produce of the farm. The pigs had become greedy and were keeping much of the produce for themselves and giving the remains to the other animals. When they had a common enemy, the pigs were sincere and fought for the freedom of all animals. But when the farmer was abolished and they gained control of it, some of the pigs under the leadership of Napoleon started to do to the other animals what the greedy farmer used to do to all of them. Some of the pigs started behaving like men. They started living in luxury, while their fellow animals labored hard and barely had enough to get by. Fellow South Africans, does this part of the story not sound too familiar? Instead of man being the enemy, now the enemy of the animals in the farm was another group of animals. In other words, their own kind became their enemy. Instead of fighting oppression from humans, now the animals had to fight social and financial inequality perpetrated by one of their own. Hence the saying, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Now guess what Napoleon used as a means to distract people from challenging the injustice that was taking place? Television. Yes, television. For as long as I can remember, I have held the view that television is a powerful distraction and brainwashing tool. Consider the number of soapies and series on TV today. If you pay so much money for TV, you would want to watch as much content as possible. So a lot of people spend hours watching TV. If you have a 9-to-5 job, then 8 hours of your day are owned by your employer and the rest are owned by mainstream media and the government. The average person therefore does not have time to think about what is really going on in our world. The strategy is simple. Keep them busy and distracted until they accept the unacceptable. Napoleon's regime owned all mainstream media platforms like TV and radio, meaning that the worldview of the animals was conditioned and shaped by the government. When they own the media, they can bend it all they want, said John Mayer in his hit song, Waiting on the World to Change. Not only does TV distract the people, it also shapes their worldview, thus preventing them from being independent thinkers. Napoleon said that the watching of television must be part of the culture of the farm. And he also said the possession of the farm's best produce by the elite must also be part of the farm's culture. In other words, let excessive TV watching be accepted as normal, and let the looting of the land's resources by the government be considered normal as well. Even though deep down the animals knew that there was something terribly wrong with what was happening, they had been brainwashed to believe that Napoleon is never wrong. Do you know that the idea of income tax was actually inspired by greed? But because almost every government enforces it, not many see anything wrong with it. Business taxes, government service admin fees, and profits generated from state-owned enterprises are enough to run a country. Why request a stake from individual income as well? In our country, taxpayers' money is used to bail out state-owned enterprises who generally mismanage money. Most people don't see income tax as a violation of private property ownership because SARS is a government-ordained body. So because the government requires it, then it must be right. Sounds like how the animals in Animal Farm felt about Napoleon, as they were brainwashed to believe that Napoleon is always right, no matter what he does. The acceptance of various injustices carried out by the government is underpinned by the belief that the government is always right. And when they give some of the money back during e-filing, it seems like they are fair. That is part of the game. E-filing is manipulative guilt. That is, we are taking so much money from the people. Let's give back some of it, Shem. If you consider how much they take and how much you get back, the returns are a joke. We will steal about 18 to 45% of your total income and give you about 5% back if you are lucky. If we don't own the full fruits of our labor, then does that not make the working class a group of glorified slaves? In reality, who do we work for? If the government takes its share of your money which you work hard for before you can see or touch it, then whose property are you really? Frank Shodorov was an extraordinary thinker and writer and hugely influential in the 1950s. He wrote what became an American classic, arguing that the income tax, more than any other legislative change in American history, made it possible to violate individual rights, one of the founding principles of that nation. He argues that income taxes are different from other forms because they deny the right of private property and presume government control over all things. While tax was always a part of ancient governments, those taxes were mostly levied against businesses and property owners, not ordinary working citizens. Income tax seems to have been introduced on a wider scale by Great Britain and the US in the 1800s to fund their wars. Let us consider a few quotes from Frank Shodorov's book titled Income Tax, The Root of All Evil. Keep in mind that Shodorov wrote based on the American context, but the ideas he is expressing are applicable to any country that collects income tax. Lots of learned expositions have been written on income taxation, and a wealth of intellect has been expended in its support. But when one looks to bottom causes, one finds them quite simple. Income taxation appeals to the governing class because in its everlasting agency for power, it needs money. The only beneficiaries of income taxation are the politicians, for it not only gives them the means by which they can increase their benefits, but it also enables them to improve their importance. The have-nots who support the politicians in the demand for income taxation do so only because they hate the haves. Although they delude themselves with the thought that they might get some of the pelt, the fact is that the taxing of incomes cannot in any way improve their economic condition. So then, the sum of all the arguments for income taxation comes to political ambition and the sin of covetousness. It should be pointed out, however, that throughout the debate, emphasis was placed on raising money only for the proper expense of government. None of the advocates of income taxation spoke of expanding the functions of government. And while the opposition mentioned socialism, it seems doubtful that they had any idea of a New Deal. The American mind of the 19th century was incapable of comprehending paternalism, regulation, and control. It was too strongly rooted in the past for that. Even those who advocated the tax method of undermining private property were not aware of what they were doing and would have probably stopped in their tracks if they could have foreseen the consequences of their proposal. It was not any agency for big government, which they could not even have understood, that prompted them to advocate income taxation. It was simply an agency to soak the rich, the very common sin of envy. It is interesting to note that in nearly all the economics courses, it is taught that the income tax is the proper instrument for for the regulation of the country's economy. That private property is not an absolute right. In fact, there are no absolute rights. That the economy ills of the country are traceable to the remnants of free enterprise. That the economy of the nation can be sound only when the government manages prices, controls wages, and regulates operations. This was not taught in the colleges before 1913. The child's mind will never be exposed to the idea that the individual is the one big thing in the world, that he has rights which come from a higher source than the bureaucracy. Thus, the immunities of property, body, and mind have been undermined by the 16th Amendment. The freedoms won by Americans in 1776 were lost in the Revolution of 1913. The real reason for withholding taxes is the unwillingness of workers to share their incomes with the government and the consequent difficulties of collection. To overcome this handicap, the government has simply impressed employers into its service as involuntary and unpaid tax collectors. It is a form of conscription, disregarding the right of privacy, which is an essential of liberty. The government's agents may, under the law, invade the employer's office, demand his accounts, and punish him for any infraction which they believe he has committed. They can impound his property and inflict a penalty for not having collected taxes for the government. Men live by production, but the state lives by appropriation. While the haves and the have-nots struggle over the division of existing wealth, it is the business of the state to improve itself at the expense of both. It picks up the marbles while the boys are fighting. That has been the story of man in organized society since the beginning. That this lesson of history should have escaped the reformers of the 19th century, when the habit of freedom was still strong in America, can be easily understood. What is not easily explained is the acceptance of the doctrine of benevolent government in our day, when all the evidence to the contrary is before our eyes. The income tax is not only a tax, it is an instrument that has the potentiality of destroying a society of humans. Income and inheritance taxes imply the denial of private property, and in that are different in principle from all other taxes. The government says to the citizen, your earnings are not exclusively your own. We have a claim on them, and our claim precedes yours. We'll allow you to keep some of it because we recognize your need, not your right. But whatever we grant you for yourself is for us to decide. This is no exaggeration. Take a look at the income tax report that you are required by law to make out, and you will see that the government arbitrarily sets down the amount of your income you may have for your living, for your business requirements, for the maintenance of your family, for medical expenses, and so on. After granting these exemptions with a flourish of generosity, the government decides what percentage of the remainder it will appropriate. The rest you may have. When an evil becomes customary, it tends to lose the negative value put on it, and in men's minds tends to become a good. And so we hear much these days in praise of the very kind of government which the founding fathers tried to prevent by their blueprint. That is of a paternalistic establishment ruling for and over a subject of people. A virtue has been made of what was once considered a vice. Close quote. Now, believe it or not, Bermuda, Monaco, the Bahamas, Andorra, the United Arab Emirates, and a few other countries don't collect income tax. And these countries are doing okay in terms of infrastructure and services. Perhaps one can argue and say that these countries are small, but that argument collapses when you consider that the United Arab Emirates has a population of roughly 9.4 people. South Africa once had a population of about 27 million people, which was not far from the 9.4 million people of the UAE. So 9.4 million is a comparably large number. The fact is that business tax, profits from SOEs, as well as fees from government services, like I said, are enough to build and maintain national infrastructure and provide services. United Arab Emirates is said to be one of the most pleasant countries to live. Income tax was inspired by greed, and the only beneficiaries thereof are the politicians, like we've already seen. Our government's cabinet, for example, has a lot of unnecessary roles. Certain departments can easily be merged, and certain deputy ministers are not necessary. There are a lot of efficient governments in the world with a small cabinet workforce. Some of the densely populated nations have smaller cabinets than ours. Furthermore, in our country, SOEs don't contribute much to improving the infrastructure. Instead, they require bailouts themselves, most of which come from income tax. Income tax is mass looting disguised as legislation and constitutional necessity. Governments infringe private property ownership rights by forcefully taking 18 to 45% of individual income. It is like rape. The money is taken without consent. This means that the government owns human resources. Does it not sound like modern day slavery? Of course it is. We don't really work for ourselves. We work for the employer and the government. What you take home after everyone takes their cut is just enough to keep you in the job. And so the cycle continues until you die. Apples and milk were regarded as Animal Farm's best produce, which had now been reserved for the leaders alone. According to Napoleon, apples and milk feed the brain, and if the brains of the ruling pigs were not fed, Napoleon suggested that Jones the farmer would come back. In other words, they used fear to manipulate the other animals into accepting their selfishness and abuse of power. If we don't keep all the apples and milk, the greedy farmer will come back. Do you want the greedy farmer to come back? If you don't continue voting for us, the apartheid regime will come back. Do you want the apartheid regime to come back? So for all our sakes, we will continue to loot. Obviously, no one wants the return of a system that used to oppress them. But are people no longer thinking, do we really believe that apartheid can come back if there can be a change of power? Are we then going to use this unfounded fear to justify keeping in power a government that is no longer serving us? Now, whoever stood up against the injustice was called a traitor and was demonized. Snowball wanted to improve the lives of the animals, but was called a traitor and was banished from the farm because he refused to be loyal to corruption. Napoleon amended the original constitution to accommodate his selfish agenda, and in this way the animals came to accept the unacceptable. As we have seen, the introduction of income tax was a tweaking of the constitution to justify a clear evil. Lesson number 7. When the humans were in charge, they mistreated the animals, but when the animals gained power, the humans suddenly wanted to do business with them. Certain countries supported the apartheid regime, but when the regime was abolished, some of those countries wanted to trade with the new government of South Africa, and they did. Be careful of those that only care about you when you are up. Those that want to associate with you only when you are in good space don't really care about you. They only associate with you for their own selfish reasons. I now know who my true friends are. Tough times have separated the real from the fake for me. You must thank God for the tough times, because otherwise you would not know who genuinely cares about you and who is in your life only because they want something. Lesson number 8. Emotional blackmail is a big part of the operation of greedy governments. Even though he did not uphold his doctrines and values, Napoleon used Old Major's legacy to manipulate the animals into maintaining their support of him. I don't have to expand on this one now, should I? This is the height of manipulation. Lesson number 9. It is almost impossible to serve people whose struggles you cannot relate with. Hebrews 4:15 says the following about Jesus: "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses." To serve people, you need to understand what it is like to be them. Most government leaders live in posh suburbs where they are not privy to the day-to-day struggles of the people they are mandated to serve. They only go to the slums when they need to campaign for votes, and they disappear again when the elections are over. Napoleon no longer became distinguishable from humans. He became so far removed from the other farm animals and their interests that there was no way he was going to serve them selflessly. Napoleon had become exactly like the enemy he fought against when Jones was in charge of the farm. During the apartheid regime, blacks were isolated and placed in their own locality, what came to be known as the townships. This reflected the idea of two separate worlds, that is, all humans are equal, but some are more equal than others. Most of our politicians are not affected by the consequences of their lack of service delivery because they don't stay where the real problems are. For example, most of their kids go to private schools, sometimes even international schools, so they don't feel the effect of their weak education system. Most of them use private health institutions, so they don't feel the effects of having one doctor on a busy night at Bara. They make enough money to own state-of-the-art generators. They can even afford to own multiple houses, so the load shedding caused by their maladministration does not affect them much. When something does not affect you directly, your manner regarding the solution will be casual. That is it, folks. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe. You can also like my page on Facebook, that is KJMac, and you can also follow me on Instagram at KJMac1. Until next time, have a blessed day.